and I'm sure Jack would be happy to deal with them.
Yes, sir.
Jack, thank you very much. I'm Steve Strauss. I live right here in Orchard Cove. Your efforts are stupendous, and in our quest for altruism, hopefully you represent one of those beacons.
I don't know about that.
As opposed to feeding at the trough.
I think as a trained historian, I tend to be idealistic.
Yeah, yes, that's wonderful. I'm interested in your opinion about the potential profound effects in terms of demographics that we are now faced over 10 years with a huge, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, demand for good senior housing, because we now have the introduction of millions of baby boomers who are no longer babies. So do you have a sense of how that might go, both practically and politically?
Practically, they want to stay living where they are.
That's right.
For the most part. That can be both positive and negative. But when I think of why, the reason we wanted to move to a CCRC when we did 12 years ago was that all my forebears had died of heart attacks at age 72. And I wanted my wife to be in a supportive environment before I kicked off. And because that can happen anytime. It might happen right now while I'm standing in front of you. So they want nowadays it's much easier to begin to stay in place. One of the things that was big for us was transportation. My wife, she lived many years in Boston. She never drove a car. She doesn't like to drive a car. We live in California. Now we have Uber and Lyft. Increasingly, Amazon now, you can order groceries and they're delivered right away. And so there are a lot of things which are emerging that are making it easier for people to stay put where they are. And that creates a tremendous problem of loneliness and isolation. It may be fine, you know, you're living there in a big house with your husband, and you say to your husband, gee, wouldn't it be nice to move to a CCRC? He says, no way, never. Not while I'm alive, we're not moving. So now he dies, there you are all alone in this big house. And that can be very lonely. Now there are some technical things that can allow people to connect with each other. In New York, they have a very successful program called the Virtual Senior Center, which is very interesting, linking up people who are homebound and allowing them to participate in discussion groups and that sort of thing. And so there are things that can be done on that, but I think that becomes a problem. So eventually, many of these people will come to CCRCs, but the CCRC that they come to will not be what we've known with independent living. They'll be coming there when they're ready for assisted living.
Yeah.
And so increasingly, I think you'll see CCRCs trending toward becoming no more than assisted living, high quality assisted living, but assisted living nonetheless. And the coming generation seems very reluctant to give up their independence and move into a place where a provider makes the decisions. They do that as institutionalization.
Thank you, Jack. When you're in the right place, you can fall.
Well, that's a reminder to me that I'm 81 years old. I don't have the balance I used to have.
With respect to entrance fees, is there anything that you could recommend that residents can currently do to get a better feeling for the safety and stability of the entrance fees? For instance, could they put them in a revocable trust, an irrevocable trust? Is that a possibility, assuming management allows, or is there any other steps?
I think it would be a mistake to lock up those funds, because the providers need them to run the business. if the providers had appropriate liability calculations and had suitable liquidity projections so that they were able to meet all their liquidity obligations, then there's no problem in having them be used by buildings and that sort of thing. So I would not favor locking up the fund. Some people say they ought to be in escrow. Now, when you come to the refundable, there are many different forms of refundable contracts, but some require the sale of your residential unit to a successor resident. That creates a Ponzi scheme. The nonprofits are not regulated. Publicly traded companies are prohibited by the Securities and Exchange laws from having Ponzi's. Nonprofits are not prohibited. So Ziegler, I think it was, that came up with this. When the market started to lag, they came up with a refundable fee, and originally they persuaded the accountants to treat it the same as a non-refundable fee. Well, that's now changing. The accountants are beginning to get a little more integrity, or at least FASB is trying to. The AICPA is pushing back against FASB. So there's a question there. But I think if they were required to properly manage their finances, it could be done. The only problem that the nonprofits would have is the problem of raising capital, getting equity capital, because typically they don't get the kind of donation. Sometimes you'll have a wealthy person give the property, the land where the buildings are situated, but there's only so much money you can raise through donations, and plus, when people start giving large amounts, they start wanting to have a say in the enterprise. So whether the nonprofit form as it is today will persist, or it may become more like what we had with mutual insurance companies at one time, but even they had to go out into the capital markets, so they demutualized largely. And I think you may have a similar kind of conversion for this industry at some point. But again, these are deep questions. If we can get the provider's attention to sit down and talk, we could find solutions. But I think they're comfortable the way things are, and we're there for life, and they're there till they get their next job. So it's different.
I'm financially naive, so let me ask a naive question. I live in a CCRC that gives you 90% of your entrance fee when you leave the whole entire campus. And we pay increasing monthly fees as time goes on. Did I hear you say in your model that the monthly fee should decrease?
Well, okay. Let's say you didn't have entrance fees at all. You just ran a rental community.
There are more of those now, at least in this
Yeah.
state.
Yeah.
So and it could, if the laws permitted, issue a continuing care contract. Many do not, but some states prohibit. Some states tie continuing care contracts to an entrance fee. But setting aside that technicality for a minute, let's say the monthly fee was $10,000 a month, but if you paid a $300,000 entrance fee, it would drop to $7,500 a month. So the entrance fee would equate to $2,500. Now, let me ask you, were you an initial resident in your CCRC, or were you a successor resident? You were initial. How many of you were successor residents in your city? Okay, when you paid your entrance fee, did you agree that your entrance fee would be used to pay a refund to your predecessor?
No, but it did.
So,
Our contract does say that the money is not put in escrow. Our contract is more upfront, I think, than some, because it says very clearly that your money is not put in escrow.
well, I think they put that in because there have been some resident groups
There
have been pressing that these money should be escrowed. And even some regulators, not all regulators are really sophisticated, so.
Well, despite the fact that our contract very clearly states that, big font, large margins, very clear, we have some residents who believe our money is in escrow.
How many of you believe that your CCRC is better than all the others?
You don't really know.
That's why we're here.
I think what you're addressing, for the most part, for all intents, is for the continuing care community, the life care. It needs actuarial assistance, principally, to protect itself. It doesn't have it. But I'm in a for-profit, monthly, regular, whatever. And we have to see that it's properly managed and runs for a profit in order to secure our refund when we leave. But we're not subject to the problems. When you say a for-profit pleads the fifth, you're really talking about a continuing care facility, because there's no, in my place, there's no obligation other than for them to give me the next monthly whatever, and my refund when it comes. I have an 85% refund. I want my family to know that I'm going to get that back. And I can see that in a for-profit, because in Massachusetts there is a requirement for financial disclosure that protects me. But we don't want to mix what
Protect you at all.
we're doing and what you're doing.
Means they can tell you.
I inferred, since you mentioned an 85% refund, did you pay the interest? Then you're in it. You're in the game. We're not different from you. You're in the game.
I pay a monthly fee. And I get a financial statement that says they made money.
Yeah, well, that's always a good sign.
I don't get all, I don't get 100% of my fee, I get 85%.
Yeah.
That's the way they all.
15% goes to rehabbing my facility. Number
Well,
one.
money is money. It can go to whatever they intend.
Yeah, in my situation, and for many
This
years,
is you, right?
I'm not arguing with you, I'm just saying that.
No, I think this is very elucidating, because I suspect there are a lot of people here
I think
who find this stuff very complicated.
If it was a continuing care
Sent you this
facility, we
email.
would want to have a lot more
Okay, this is
information.
sitting right here.
It is, if it
sent
has
you an
two
email.
or more levels of care.
Yeah, he sent me this
It
email.
does have two or more.
This is my email. Yeah, right. So he said he just
That's
sent
all it
me
takes.
this email.
But it's
He said he
inflation.
just sent me this email, so
See,
he
which,
wants to
continuing
maybe talk to you
care
about this.
placement on.
No, you're talking about life.
This is
care.
his
Life care.
I'm just looking at it. Yeah.
Life
You're
care.
talking about life.
You're talking about life care.
Yeah.
That's what you're
Okay,
saying.
yeah, life.
I have sponsored legislation.
I think there's an artificial distinction.
What does he
If
want?
you
I don't
pay
know,
an
he's sitting right
entrance
here so he
fee,
can talk to you.
your reasonable expectation is that the monthly fee thereafter will be lower, reflecting the fact that you prepaid part of your lifetime living expense. It may be just for your rent, but you're probably paying less. So
Okay.
they're all the same. That's really tantamount to a single premium life annuity.
We are, Jack, I think you're going back to the three different kinds of continuing care that you started out explaining. We are not type A. Type A is life care. We live in the same place. We are a type C continuing care, which I think is probably what the vast majority of people here are in. Well, type A is life care where your fee doesn't change as you move from place to place. But type C is where your fee changes as you move from independent to assisted.
Fee-for-service.
But that's a form of continuing care. All of our advertising says we're continuing care. Continuing care has different forms. Life care is the kind where it doesn't, some of those places got into trouble because they didn't take inflation into consideration.
Well, Pacific Homes specifically said that the initial monthly fee would never increase. And then they tried to, I'm giving you a historical example. Pacific Homes was a major provider on the West Coast that went bankrupt in 1976.
I've been there 6 years and I've had 3 raises of it.
Yes, we've all had raises, regardless of whether you have a type A or a type C. That entrance fee is simply reducing the monthly cost. There's a myth in the industry that you don't need actuarial input if you do a type C contract. That's flat out not true. If you're giving a lifetime contract that's dependent on human life contingencies and mortality, that has to be priced so that it reflects the mortality that's expected for that particular CCRC, or it won't be workable. So that's just a myth in the industry that they use to counter legislative initiatives which try to bring more soundness to the industry. The industry has struggled, and part of it is, I think, because it comes from a clerical background. And churches don't think of having a positive balance sheet. They just last until they no longer can last, and then they close. But that's different. Well, I think you're thinking you're more different than you are, in fact.
Well, we don't have a lifecare contract.
No.
No, very few of us do.
I don't have a life care contract either. If my wife, I have a friend whose wife, she had Alzheimer's, she lived many years, 10 years. She lived in the SNF. He had it in his apartment. He had to pay $4,500 a month for his apartment, $9,000 a month for her care in the SNF. He was paying close to $15,000 a month for care because it was a type C contract. I understand what you're saying, because if he had had a type A contract, he might have paid a little more. He might have paid $5,000 for that contract, but he wouldn't have had that big hit. And the argument that's made is that why pay for care when you might not need it? Let those who need the care pay the cost. And the other argument is, well, you want peace of mind, so you ought to insure that cost, and that ought to be in the life care. That's an argument that, or a distinction that people can reasonably make. And every CCRC could offer that as an option if they chose to. That's simply a financial option. They can be actuarially equivalent.
You made the statement that the organizations are required to keep if your funds run out. Would you clarify that?
Yes, revenue, well, are you in a nonprofit?
Yes.
Okay. Nonprofits risk their nonprofit status if they were to expel somebody for non-payment of the rent. They're required under Revenue Ruling 72-124 as a condition of their nonprofit status, their tax exempt status, to keep residents in residence when their funds run out.
But there's restrictions on how you can spend your funds then, right?
There are spend down rules. Medicare has spend down rules. I've heard of a case, I've not documented it, where a resident was denied that protection because they'd gone on a cruise. It comes back to what we said there. It depends on the good faith and fair dealing of the provider. And not all providers are the same. And not all people working in executive positions in a single enterprise may be the same. So there are questions.
Thank you. I have a question. Since I have this, I'm just going to ask it. Would you say more about the problem of, now the word's escaping me, I'm getting older, of bankruptcies, why they happen, how frequent they are in these places, and what our rights are in bankruptcy?
We have very few rights. The courts, I think, generally try to take a protective view toward residents, but there are lots of steps short of bankruptcy. When a place starts failing financially, then they look for a merger partner to try to, as a white knight, to save them. or
sell the place.
or they may put the place up for auction. Is there anybody here from Masonic Homes? So, there are lots of things that can happen short of actual bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is a federal level proceeding. So, for example, at Air Force Village West, which has been operating, and is now in receivership, the debt holders refused to allow it to go to bankruptcy because they didn't want to take a haircut on the debt. They want 100 cents on the dollar of the debt. And since the only sources of money are the residents, donors, and the bondholders, if the bondholders are going to get 100 cents, donors aren't going to make it up. So the residents, it's affecting the residents there. And the residents have no standing to move into bankruptcy court. So they've appointed Bel-Ann Riley as a receiver, and she's now working under the jurisdiction of a state court, running that place, trying to find a buyer to take it out of bankruptcy because they ran out of cash. The lenders, still seeking to get their 100 cents on the dollar, have agreed to advance money. I think they're agreed to advance $5 million, but they're burning through roughly $500,000 a month, so that won't last that long. The residents there did not hire a lawyer. This was something Warren wanted me to mention. They trusted all the representations made to them by the provider. So the residents are basically unprotected. It's on the property which has now become a logistics center. So if it was decided that the highest and best use of that property would be for logistics, say an Amazon center, the residents could be relocated elsewhere. I don't think they'd be evicted out onto the street. They'd probably try to place them in other communities. But residents really have no protections now because we're junior to the debt holders, except in the case of, what's the name of your community? Yeah, Southgate, and there may be others, where they give the entrance fees a first deed of trust. That's a great comfort. Well, you're lucky. You can raise your hand and say you've got the best.
When you're 98 years old, you get to run the place.
Well, I don't think you'd do that. I think you'd probably hire the same people to run it. When my building in New York went co-op, we hired the landlord to be our managing agent, and he trained us in how to run it. And so I think that's what would happen.
Can I add one more thing?
Well,
Our entrance fees provide the capital for our place at no cost.
so you should have had a prospectus because you were asked to make an investment.
Well, we don't benefit in any profit.
That's right.
So it's
So
not.
it was just a
that
blue,
doesn't apply.
you're saying it was a blue sky investment.
You can call it that. But we get statements every year as to the staff.
Okay, well, you're a lucky man.
Based on your comments, should we infer that it's safer to put your money in a for-profit CCRC than in a not-for-profit CCRC?
No, they can both, I told you about the V Palo Alto situation. They can both be exploitative. And incidentally, the top executives of Lifeway used to work for V. But there's a lady over here who's very...
Yes, there's been a lot of discussion about the contract. I'm very curious, even for those people who would read the contract and understand it, have any of the CCRCs changed a contract that you know of when somebody questions the wording in the contract? Or are they, this is the contract, if you don't like it, don't move here?
There's rumbling. I've heard a lawyer say that he managed to get them to change the contract. When I signed my contract, incidentally, my wife and I, we were given one contract to review, and when we showed up for the signing, we were presented with a different contract. The lawyer had changed the contract. So we hired a lawyer to get the benefits of the contract we've been given to review, because that was sort of switch the papers. But I did cross out the arbitration provision and say I didn't accept it, and the marketing person, who was the only person there, accepted that. So my wife and I would not be bound by that, but in general, it's a contract of adhesion. If in those states where the contract has to be filed with the regulators, they can't really change the contract without going back and refiling with the regulator unless this language to be changed is what's called variable language, filed as variable language. So in general, they wouldn't. Now, any contract can be changed by mutual consent of the parties after it's in place. That generally wouldn't happen. No state law can change a contract. The United States Constitution says that no state shall make any law impairing the rights of contract. So only the federal government can change contracts that are in place by legislative action, and that's why bankruptcy courts are at the federal level, and that's why the debt providers didn't want to go to the federal level, because the federal bankruptcy judge could change the debt covenants to help make up some of the laws.
One of the questions that keeps coming up is, among our residents, do we all have the same contract? And I'm not sure that whether, or do you know, whether a current resident can ask to see the new contract that's being offered to prospective residents?
I don't know why that would be permitted, but so there's nothing that we can tell that. Now, in all fairness, people in the CCRC where I live had that concern, particularly after the provider changed the contract near the time when I moved in, which is how I got caught in that little catch-22. So I went out and did get some contracts and make some comparisons. Paul Gordon of Hanson Bridget has developed a standard, a model contract, which you can buy for $100 from the American Senior Housing Association. And I bought that contract, and virtually all contracts that I've seen are comparable to that model contract that Paul Gordon drafted years ago. So I don't see a lot of variations, although there are minor things. So our provider wrote in a whole provision relating to this requirement of keeping residents in residence, and they wrote in words that they, in their sole discretion, etc.
Ames has a qualification or an explanation for Massachusetts, and then we'll have time for only one more question. So this will be the guy back here, Frank.
All right.
He has a comment.
Okay. Point of information, there is a requirement in Massachusetts for provide a disclosure statement. And disclosure statements generally outline the terms of the contract, amongst other things. So one can see the change in contracts over a period of time by requesting a copy of the disclosure statement.
Are they required to give you the disclosure statements?
They are required by law. This is the rights of
rights of
residence law that was passed.
No, you do have that. That's
Upon
true.
request.
By the way, the disclosure, we have the same requirement in California. I'll speak loud so you don't have to bring the microphone, because I think we have one more question. But anyway, we had the same requirement in California. Our disclosure statement differed from our contract. The difference was that the old contract provided 30 days free care in the care center. The new contract you pay from day one. And so we were able to prevail legally because of the disclosure statement. So that was a big help. Yes, sir.
I'll be brief with two questions. The for-profits in the state of Massachusetts have a requirement for the disclosure statement, as this gentleman indicated. Included with that is the audit report from the accountants. The audit report, the financial audit report, it should be in there, and that should be provided on an annual basis for the profits, just as for the
I
non-profits.
did see that for one or two in the documents on the website.
Yes.
The website, by the way, has broken links, so I don't think the Office of Elder Affairs, you know, they had to do it and they did it, so there are some questions there.
Yeah.
And not all providers provide full information as you might expect.
Right, and what might be an approach to address that issue from your perspective?
I don't think this is a disclosure problem. I think this is a financial soundness problem.
Right.
And unless we address the fundamentals, this industry will continue to generate adverse publicity, which will shrink its market share. And so I think it's, the providers need to take the lead, and that's been problematic. And part of it is because there are the 3 provider organizations, and they don't cooperate. And that's a sad commentary.
I see 3 parts to the community. I see the residents as an investor. I see the outside investors as the second investors, the investment folks, and third, the operators. From your perspective, as far as advocacy for the future, are we best to address the issue through the accounting finance area of the AICPA or through the insurance association of the Commonwealth? Because the 3 of us, at the end of the day, have an interest. The residents, the investors, as well as the operators, and for the viability of those 3 parties, that disclosure has to be clearly outlined.
The accountants, to be blunt, claim that they're independent and they're not. So the insurance department is independent. The National Association of Insurance Commissioners is independent.
I want to thank Jack and also say he will be here until the end, I believe, this afternoon.